Chapter 5. Departing from the caves of Mahavir Das Tatwala Baba, I lived again as a wandering mendicant. The winter was coming to a close. As the sun shone warmer, the days grew longer, and spring buds appeared in the trees and bushes. One day, as I walked along a jungle pathway headed north, I came to the Lakshman Jhulan, a long suspension bridge that crosses high over the river Ganges. Standing in the gentle swaying middle, I beheld the Ganges descending from the Himalayas, ornamented on either side by temples, ashrams, and rishis performing their rituals. I crossed the bridge and walked along a dirt pathway and into the forest. Suddenly I froze, unable to bear the chilling sight before me. Dying people, some naked, others in filthy rags, were wailing in agony. Their faces shriveled and deformed, their noses melted away, their hands and feet mangled with bloody stubs instead of fingers or toes. Emaciated from starvation, people lay in holes in the ground that served as beds and buried their bodies with blankets of dirt against the cold. All of them were pleading to me through desperate eyes. I was horrified. I had stumbled into a leper colony. Dozens of lepers surrounded me, crying out, "Bakshish, bakshish, bakshish!" Pressing their bodies against mine, they stuck their mangled, bloody hands into my face and demanded charity. But I had nothing to give, and imprisoned by a wall of putrefied flesh, couldn't move a single step. They refused to leave me. Bakshish, bakshish, bakshish! The mob shoved so tightly around me that I was being smothered. I could not escape the stench of their breath and oozing, rotting flesh. Bakshish, they screamed. My mind reeled in confusion, struck by ambivalence. On the one hand, I was outraged to be so accosted. On the other hand, I pitied them, granting that their misery justified their behavior. An endless 20 minutes passed. Agonizing, I tried to come to grips with what was happening. Leprosy is contagious, I thought. Will I be afflicted to suffer and die with them? Will this mob ever release me? Screaming, "Bakshish!" the lepers tugged and shoved one another in a desperate skirmish. Their eyes seared mine with stares of anguish. Finally, they patted me down for valuables. What I didn't give, they were determined to take by force. When they realized that I didn't have anything, they dispersed. Taking a deep breath, I took a few steps, but was stopped in my tracks. I saw an old woman in rags, her nose melted into the decaying flesh of her deformed face, lying on the ground in misery. Our eyes locked. In her teary eyes, I felt the tender love of a mother, an affection real and rare. She wanted nothing from me but to open my heart to receive the love she so longed to give someone. She was beautiful. Folding her fingerless hands in a gesture of respect, she then extended her disease-smitten hand to bless me. All my fear of contamination was slain by her affection. I rushed to her side and placed my head under her palm to receive her blessing. "May God bless you, my child," she prayed. "May God bless you." I looked up and saw that now her face was lit with a supernatural joy, the joy of giving. I wept, feeling the whole ordeal to be a small price for this unforgettable blessing. Walking on, I found a spot by the river and gazed down into the rushing current. I tried to glimpse beneath the swirling waves, but was unable to see below the surface into its mysterious depths. Although that woman was plagued with a despicable disease, beneath the surface, she was a beautiful soul who only wanted to love and be loved. In my contemplation, I extended the analogy. Today, the river is exposing how we have the tendency to judge others by their surface appearance and to find only their negative qualities. But if we search beneath the surface, we discover that a myriad of strains mix together to create a particular person's nature. The faults we perceive are likely to be the effect of circumstances, the psychological response to trauma, abuse, rejection, heartbreak, insecurity, pain, confusion, or disease. I thought of the people who had nearly killed me in Istanbul, the racists that hated the blacks during the civil rights movement, the people who had mistreated me because of my long hair, and even myself, how I had judged the generation I'd rebelled against, thinking older Americans wrong to be so concerned with money and security, when in fact they had lived through the Great Depression, a hardship I could not fathom. If we understand the underlying cause of what we think of as bad in someone, instead of being hateful, we will be compassionate. For is not every soul inherently good? A saintly person will hate the disease, but love the diseased. I decided to leave Rishikesh and traveled north into the higher elevations of the Himalayas. In Dev Prayag, I came upon a man whose character is forever engraved in the slate of my memory. On a chilly morning, as the stars were fading and the new day's sun was about to emerge, I scrambled down a mountain to the place the rivers Bhagirathi and Alaknanda converge. From the point of this confluence, the river is called the Ganges. The river's song there was tumultuous. I submerged myself for a bath, ignorant of the power of the current. As I took a step forward, the rushing current yanked my feet from under me and swept me toward the treacherous rapids. At that moment, a powerfully built man who happened to be bathing beside me seized my arm with a vice-like grip and pulled me toward him, then onto the riverbank. My rescuer then placed his right palm on my head and with great feeling chanted a series of mantras for my protection. This is how I first met Kailash Baba. A holy man who appeared well in his 60s, he had a powerful build and matted graying hair that he coiled around his head. When unwrapped, I would learn it extended to the ground. Decades passed since he had cut any hair from his body. He had a square face, large brown eyes, high cheekbones, and a full mouth of teeth, something quite rare among old sadhus. All he wore was a single quilt garment that extended from his shoulders to his feet. In his hand, he carried an iron trident with a huge damaru drum tied to the top. This drum had 2 heads, each about 12 inches in diameter, on opposite ends of a hollow wooden drum base. Between the heads, a ball hung on a string. When the Baba shook it, the ball bounced back and forth, beating loudly on the drums. A metal begging bowl and an old blanket were his only other possessions. Kailash Baba was the first to instruct me in how to survive as a wandering ascetic. On cold nights, we slept on hillsides, often overlooking a river. One night he offered me his blanket, and although I at first refused to take it, he insisted. For many nights, we slept together under one blanket. He taught me how to procure food and medicine by identifying the edible roots, fruits, and leaves in the forest. Taking me into a village, he instructed me on the proper behavior in which a sadhu respectfully begs alms. Unlike the West, the begging of religious mendicants in rural India is considered an honorable way of life, because the people receive so much in return from the sadhus they serve by giving alms. And as Kailash Baba was such an exalted person, I too felt that this was an exalted thing to do. He educated me in surviving on dried, flat, chipped rice, because it is the cheapest food. Any grain merchant will gladly offer it. And because it does not spoil, it can sustain one in the jungle for weeks. All that is required for a meal is to add some stream water to a portion of it. He taught me also how to clean my body by brushing my teeth with the twig of the neem tree and washing my skin with mud from the riverbed. Beyond lessons in how to eat and clean myself, he taught me how to respect not just sacred rivers, temples, trees, the sun, the moon, and the sacred fire, but also snakes, scorpions, and wild animals. He did not speak English, but seemed to have a mystical ability to transmit ideas to me, particularly the idea that God was in the heart of all creatures. He taught me to see the soul within the heart of a poisonous snake, for example, and to show my honor and respect for the creature by giving it its space. And when among other sadhus, he trained me in the etiquette of how to address different denominations and how to eat with them. As we traveled alone together, he became more and more like a father to me, and he lavished affection on me as if I were his own son. Although we never talked, where there is affection of the heart, communication transcends all language barriers. By a simple gesture, pointing of the finger, smile or frown, he taught me whatever I was to learn. To an onlooker, he appeared to be a fearsome, unkempt mountain of a man, hardened by austerities and carrying an iron trident. But I found in him one of the kindest, gentlest men I ever met. Whatever simple food we collected, he always fed me to my satisfaction before he would take anything. When I resisted taking first, he easily defeated me by his innocent glance. In fact, every time he looked at me, affectionate tears filled his eyes. This man, a mountain of affection, drew a love from my heart like a lifelong friend. From him and the other people I was meeting, I had begun to learn more about the different manifestations of God, or deities, that made up the pantheon of Hindu religion. I wasn't sure how I felt about all of these deities and the many forms they took. It was all quite foreign to me, but I could see the deep love and devotion these manifestations inspired. My mind was open, and I was eager to understand. A worshiper of Shiva, the aspect of God presiding over material existence and its destruction, Kailash Baba constantly chanted the mantra, Om Namah Shivaya. As we walked along the forest pathways, he would call out the names of Lord Shiva, Jai Shankar, Hey Vishwanath, Hey Kedaranathji, Hey Umamata. Whenever we were with other worshippers of Shiva or Shivites, we chanted together. When the chant reached its crescendo, Kailash Baba would enter into a trance and wildly play the damaru drum. It resounded almost to a deafening volume. That drum made the sadhus wild with joy. Madly they shook their heads, their matted hair whipping from side to side. Some clapped, while others sprang to their feet to perform a mystical dance. Among these homeless sadhus, Kailash Baba was highly revered. One aged ascetic in the forest confided to me that Kailash Baba could be several hundred years old. No one really knew his age. He possessed supernatural yogic powers to heal the sick and perform extraordinary feats. About 30 years ago, I witnessed his miracles, this man said. Crowds of people flocked to him, worshiping him as a god. But, he told me, Baba realized that divine life is not about powers or fame. He vowed never to speak of his powers or to make a show of them. He had neither disciples nor an ashram, but roamed alone in the forests of the Himalayas. I was not surprised to learn that Kailash Baba possessed great yogic powers, and I was impressed. But it was his character and devotion to his spiritual path that impressed me the most. As the days pass, I began to sense that Kailash Baba wished to enter into seclusion. I didn't want to impose myself on him, and I knew that it was time for me to move on. Bowing at his feet, I begged for his blessing. Baba laughed heartily and with tearful eyes hugged me with the strength of a bear, then offered his blessings with the recitation of a mantra. I was touched both by the unyielding quality of his detachment and the softness of his heart as he bid me farewell. Like a father and son, we loved each other, but as roaming sadhus, we sensed that we would never meet again. This bittersweet experience of developing dear relationships, then moving on never again to see the people I was meeting, was part of the life I had chosen. It was difficult for me, but the pain of separation kept the joy of our relationship alive in my heart. As I turned and walked away from Kailash Baba, I prayed never to forget him, and I never have. It was about this time that I shared my realizations in a letter to my family. Dear family, better to live in poverty than to sell one's soul for an empty palace of gold. Better to live unknown than to sell one's soul for the empty and futile pleasures of admiration, name, and fame. Where there is no inner freedom, there is no life. Better to die at once than to be deprived of seeking the ideal of one's life. I have been doing what I consider to be invaluable studies with great men and places of the East. Such study, please understand, takes much time. I have barely started to even approach the beginning of such a vast study. I am selfish and egotistical. I am ignorant and blind of truth. I am perhaps the farthest away from God. So it is that such a fool as me needs much time to see the blissful light of supreme truth that shines within you and me. Love, Richard. A spark of spiritual longing ignited in my childhood had been fanned into a flame while praying in a cathedral in Florence. It was kindled into a blaze while meditating on the Isle of Crete, and fueled higher and hotter by my challenges in the Middle East. Roaming the Himalayas in the company of holy men, that sacred fire in me now blazed furiously. Resigning my life to this purpose alone, I prayed to the Lord to help me. I was now 20 years old. My arduous lifestyle had reduced my weight to about 110 pounds. The one set of robes I wore were tainted gray by the silt of the rivers, ponds, and streams where I washed them. My skin had become coarse and toughened by the elements, my lips chapped with cracks, and my hair matted. I wore cheap rubber sandals, and my feet were dyed brown by soils and cracks formed around the border of my heels. The life I'd chosen was taking some toll on my health, but I showed little concern. My yearning for enlightenment now burned more brightly than ever. I loved my life as a homeless sadhu, and I rejoiced in anticipation of the next adventure and in being in the presence of magnificent souls who were advanced in their spiritual paths. Roaming through the forest, I often asked myself, will I ever find the one path I should tread, the teacher I should follow? One day, while in Dev-Prayag, I was invited to a nearby ashram for a meal among the sadhus. While there, a yogi emerged from the jungle. Nobody knew him. He advertised for the doctors of the town to assemble that evening. After several doctors arrived, the yogi made his appearance and then, with a thundering voice, challenged, "Materially infected, you have more faith in modern science than your own heritage. God has brought me out of the forest to crush your foolish pride. By yogic power, I will shut down all my life systems and die. You test me with your medical instruments. In exactly 30 minutes, I will rise from the dead." With his back erect, sitting in a lotus position, he inhaled and exhaled with great force about 20 times. Then, fully inhaling, he stopped breathing and sat motionless. Each doctor went to work with stethoscopes and other devices, but not one could detect a heartbeat, breath, or pulse. They were astonished. "He is clinically dead," one doctor announced. Skeptical, I also stepped forward and borrowed a stethoscope to check his pulse and heartbeat, but there was none. In New Delhi, Swami Rama had given me a spellbinding preview of the powers of yoga. During my time in the Himalayas, I had practiced pranayam, or breathing exercises, and asanas, physical postures, and silent meditation, to better attune my mind and body with the divine force of God. I had seen the incredible effects of these practices, the great benefits to health, and the ability of practitioners to modulate their physical realities. But this scene was truly amazing. Exactly 30 minutes later, to the second, the yogi exhaled, opened his eyes, stood up, and marched back into the jungles. He didn't ask anything from anyone. He simply wanted to show these skeptics the power of yoga. Both the doctors and myself gazed in amazement at his departing form, returning to the wilds. Wherever I traveled, people spoke reverentially of a woman saint named Anandamayi Ma. I myself had read of her extraordinary qualities in the classic Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramhamsa Yogananda, in the chapter entitled The Joy-Permeated Mother. On the bank of the Ganges at Dev-Prayag, a sadhu informed me that she was living in the Himalayan town of Dehradun. "I'm going by bus to visit the Holy Mother today," he said. "You're welcome to join me." Upon arrival, I entered into a quaint courtyard filled with the mother's followers. All were eager to see her. My companion disappeared. A small crowd gathered around me to share stories of their guru's life. I was told that Anandamayi Ma, who was the guru of the Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, was born in an obscure village in East Bengal at the dusk of the 19th century. From childhood, she was indifferent to the trappings of this world, and at times she bewildered her family by her spiritual trances. As her followers spoke to me about her ecstasies, miracles, and compassion, I became more enthralled than ever. Just then, everyone rose to their feet as a petite lady appeared in the assembly wearing a simple white sari. Greeting us with folded palms, her eyes glistened with joy, and she sat on a chair. Thin and frail, she nonetheless emanated an unearthly power. Although the lines of time were drawn upon her wrinkled face, it shone like a playful child's. She appeared wise and sober, like a universal mother, and yet she also radiated the exuberance of an innocent little girl. Although her demeanor was as soft as the flower she held in her hand, one could feel that she possessed an indomitable willpower. Smiling upon us, she led everyone in chanting God's names, all the while clapping her hands. Then, after several moments of silence, she spoke words of love, wisdom, and selflessness. "Love is everlasting forgiveness," she began. "Wisdom is to see everything in relation to the whole. If you understand that everything belongs to Him, you will be free from all burdens." Gracefully touching her hand to her heart, she closed her eyes. All sorrow comes from the sense of I and mine. All sorrow is due to one's keeping apart from God. When you are with Him, all pain disappears. By sorrow does the Lord dispel sorrow. By adversity does he destroy adversity. When this is done, he sends no more suffering, no more adversity. This must be remembered at all times. My heart was deeply moved by the affectionate exchange between the mother and her children. A breeze rustled the leaves of the surrounding trees. Looking up, Anandamayi Ma paused from speaking and gazed on a chirping sparrow. With glances and smiles, everyone relished her tender mood. The world oscillates endlessly between pleasure and pain, she continued. There can be no security, no stability here. These are to be found in God alone. Suffering is sent to remind us to turn our thoughts to God, who will give us solace. Whenever you possibly can, sustain the flow of the sacred name. To repeat his name is to be in his presence. If you associate with the Supreme Friend, he will reveal his true being to you. Her gentle glance awakened faith and hope, and her simple, unassuming nature brought peace to my heart. Although she considered herself no more than a child, everyone present accepted her as mother. In the time I spent with her, I saw renounced sadhus, yogis, and swamis, who typically keep a distance from women, sit at her feet, seeking her blessings. One day, as I sat alone in a courtyard, Anandamayi Ma gracefully appeared. To show my reverence, I knelt down and touched her feet. Hopping backward, her face tensed with humility. She appeared embarrassed. Guilt rushed through me like a whirlwind. In her gentle presence, attempting to show my reverence and respect, I nonetheless felt that I had acted barbarically. What had I done? I understood that though she was an exalted being, she must humbly prefer followers to not touch her feet. Taking pity on me in my mortification, she sat on a nearby chair. With a childlike smile, her eyes rolled up into her head, and her eyelids fluttered and then closed. In the silence of that moment, she entered into a trance. I felt an aura of motherly affection beaming from her motionless form. Mystically, her face shone like an angelic child. An intimate silence prevailed as she came out of her trance, smiled, and motioned for me to come closer. Her eyes sparkled with affection, yet as I looked deeper into them, they appeared utterly blank from desires. Silently touching a lotus flower to her nose and lips, she placed it in my hand and then, rising from her seat, departed. Enshrining this experience in my heart, I carried on with my pilgrimage. Living as a sadhu, I was coming to appreciate was a serious life. Enduring the cold winter with no warm clothes or shelter other than the bare earth or a riverbank, jungle, or cave. Being vulnerable to insects and animals both while awake and asleep. Having no help in sickness, and primarily being all alone. Still, I would not give it up. From Dehradun, I traveled northwest, higher into the Himalayas, to Uttarkashi, known by many as the Valley of the Saints. Since ancient times, yogis have taken shelter of this forest for solitude and meditation. Wandering about, I discovered a cave high in a mountain. From there, I gazed down into the forest. Over the course of days, I saw a leopard intently hunting through the foliage. One day he poised for an attack and sprang on an unsuspecting deer who sunk to the ground under the grip of the leopard's jaws. There were also nomadic packs of brown and white monkeys, sparring with one another, swinging from branch to branch in search of fruits and berries. Spotted deer chewed on green leaves, grass, and shrubs, while anxiously glancing from side to side in fear of predators. Birds of extraordinary colors flew about seeking buds, insects, or berries, while a king cobra slithered on the ground and up trees to devour prey. Unaware that a nearby mongoose was slinking behind, poised to tear it apart. These were my neighbors, and I a guest in their homeland. Remembering how Kailash Baba taught me to cultivate the proper attitude around such creatures, I prayed to be fearless. Everyone in all species must struggle for survival, as the strong exploit the weak. But in human life, I thought, there is something so much greater to pursue. Here in my forest dwelling, I would often take out from my bag and meditate on the picture of the blue boy who'd found me in New Delhi. I was increasingly drawn to this beautiful person playing the flute and wondered who he could be. Still, I asked no one. I felt his identity would be revealed according to God's plan. One spring day, sitting alone in the courtyard of a Himalayan temple, I listened to the stillness of the morning. Every so often, I could hear the low hum of a black bee drifting from flower to flower, seeking nectar. Observing it, I realized that I had adopted a similar life, moving from place to place, seeking to collect the nectar of spiritual wisdom and inspiration, but not clear enough about my desires to choose one place, one path, one teacher. Suddenly, in the distance, a baby cried for its mother. I also felt like a baby spiritually, though I lacked the spontaneous ability to cry so genuinely. When, I wondered, will the day come when I will cry like that baby for my beloved Lord? Later, as a Himalayan breeze whistled through the courtyard, rustling the sprouting leaves, I reflected on what it took to see the essence of life and shared my thoughts in a letter to my family. How is everything on that side of Mother Earth? I think maybe the more kind we are, the more kindness we will find everywhere. And the more good we are, the more good we will see everywhere. Richard. Suddenly, Gongs resounded, and a few villagers gathered in the temple courtyard, which was nothing but a small clearing within a dense forest of huge banyan, neem, and tamarind trees, with wild animals slinking about in the crisp mountain air. The villagers worshipped a deity that stood in the form of a stone statue in a one-room brick temple. After bowing on the ground, the villagers gazed fervently at the deity while offering prayers, candles, and flowers. Due to my background with Judaism and my studies of Christianity and Islam, I felt a certain discomfort with this and did not participate. Was this idol worship? I didn't really know. Trying to restrain my judgmental tendencies, I hoped in the future to better understand. A fascinating soul came upon me that day, a wandering sadhu named Bal Shiva Yogi. Perhaps in his early 40s, he was small and pudgy. He had wavy black hair, a small nose that twitched repeatedly along with his eyebrows and twinkling eyes. He behaved like a restless juvenile, frivolous and talkative. He told jokes and moved about in a nervous fashion. When begging for alms, he insisted on being given sweets, a trait I hadn't yet come across in a Himalayan mendicant. But when it came time for him to execute his yoga practices, he transformed into a pillar of intensity. His multifaceted personality made him charming company. Together, we passed a few days of close friendship until I felt a calling to enter the higher Himalayas. When I said goodbye, Bal Shiva Yogi clasped my arm. "No," he said, "I insist you come to my lecture this evening. Please?" The more I declined, the more he pleaded. I finally relented. Once at the lecture hall, I looked out over a crowd of several hundred people who had gathered before a raised platform on which Bal Shiva Yogi stood. I sat on a chair to the left side of the stage. He began the program by opening his empty hand for all to see, closed it again, went into a meditative state, and, to the crowd's astonishment, opened his hand to reveal a long black stone. It was a Shiva Lingam, a deity form of Lord Shiva. It appeared that the stone had grown right out of his hand. The crowd was transfixed. As far as I could see, this was not a magic trick. This was real magic. He placed the Shiva Lingam on a podium. Then, chanting mantras, he induced ashes to materialize from his hand. These mystical ashes poured constantly from his bare palm, showering the lingam. In about a minute, the stone was buried under a hill of ashes. The audience, myself included, was spellbound. An elderly man stood and praised the yogi, while an old woman gazed at him as if he were a god. As the demonstration concluded, the crowd came forward to worship him. Moving back, I marveled at how such a simple, restless man could possess such powers. Raising his open palm, Bal Shiva Yogi addressed the assembly in a thundering voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you have just seen is called Prapti Siddhi, a yogic art. It is only viewed as supernatural if you do not understand the science. Through yogic discipline, a person can learn to manipulate the gross elements of nature by controlling the subtle elements with the mind." Tensing his eyebrows, he warned, "But do not be fooled. What you saw is not spiritual. Rather, it is a material skill attained through meditation and austerities. I am not God, nor is anyone else who performs such supernatural feats. I am just an ordinary man with some yogic powers." With both hands, he threw some of the ashes into the air and declared, "I can create ashes, God can create universes." He paused for a moment and, staring into the audience, bellowed out his final message. True spiritual life is to know that you are beyond the body, mind, and ego, and realize the soul within, and to realize God and be godly. This alone will bring peace. As the crowd lined up to receive his blessings, Bal Shiva Yogi came to where I stood. "Are you happy you stayed?" he asked. "Yes, thank you," I said. I had been deeply impressed by his powers, of course, but more than that, I appreciated his honesty about what was truly important. I understood that if I stayed and studied with any one of these accomplished yogis, that I too might learn to perform certain feats. But I also understood that this is not at all the goal of spiritual life. "Please bless me to realize your words," I said. Laughing aloud, he embraced me like an old friend. Then he held open his hand to bless me, closed it, and opened it again to reveal a sacred Rudraksha bead, a raw, reddish seed covered with ashes. He placed it in my hand as the gift of his vibhuti, or blessing. As I roamed back into the forest, I thought about what I had just seen. It was incredible, but after my time in the Himalayas, not shocking. What was most incredible in what Bal Shiva Yogi had done is that those people were about to worship him as a god, but he stopped them. In America, athletes are worshipped for their speed and power, entertainers for their beauty and talents, scientists for their theories and inventions, politicians for their speeches and influence, scholars for their intellectual skills, and businessmen and women for their wealth. In India, yogis are worshipped for their mastery over subtle energies. Bal Shiva Yogi's honesty impressed me. True spirituality is to realize God and be godly, not to show off one's powers. Because they don't appreciate God's power, people are fascinated by these kinds of feats. Taking a seat under a sprawling banyan tree, I reflected on why people were so anxious to see such things. Everywhere we look, we witness the unsurpassable miracles of God. But because we see them constantly, we take them for granted. Picking up a seed, I examined it. God has put a gigantic banyan tree in this tiny seed, and each seed produces thousands more seeds. That's a miracle. And in a single cloud, so light it floats in the air, he stores enough water to flood an entire city. When a male and female come together to procreate, they have no engineering plan on how the child will develop at each stage. It just happens. What a miracle! Every species is empowered with amazing talents to fly, swim, run, climb trees, walk up walls, or create civilizations. Could all this be happening by random chance? Creation is nothing but one amazing miracle after another. It was hard not to feel awed that a human could move the material world in such ways. But Baal Shiva Yogi had rightly challenged his spellbound audience. I can create ashes, God can create universes.